It's both a honor, but also a great personal treat to have Dale Russakoff with us and with me. You all know her from the Washington Post reporting days and from her great books. But Alelia and Debbie, and to some extent Wendell, we know her from the class of '74. They're redoing that Anderson Bridge with our plaque.
Yes,
Dale wrote a really good piece about somebody putting a plaque on the bridge in Cambridge where Quentin Compson committed suicide fictionally in the Faulkner novel. So Dale is from Birmingham and has covered a wide variety of things, but this great triumph, which has gotten universal gushes of reviews, is the prize. And it's the fascinating story of the money that Mark Zuckerberg gave to the city of Newark and Cory Booker. But it expands out to show the desire, but also the arrogance, the good intentions, but the difficult ways people deal with school reform. So it's actually a larger picture of the school reform movement. Alma Gildenhorn, thank you for sponsoring this series. So let me start, Dale, by welcoming you and asking you, tell us how it began with Mark Zuckerberg deciding to give this money.
Well, it began with initially Cory Booker persuading Governor Christie, who had total control of the schools in Newark because the state had controlled the schools for 15 years, to make a commitment to work with him to, as he said, transform the Newark public schools. He said he wanted to create a hemisphere of hope, as he called it, in which every school in Newark would be high performing. And all they needed was a philanthropist to support the reforms that they had in mind. And so Cory Booker, who has a remarkable ability to persuade people to give money to Newark, he actually had a network of people who, one of whom was close to Mark Zuckerberg, and found out that Zuckerberg at age 26 wanted to make his first gift as a philanthropist and wanted to do it in education. As he said, he wanted to do something big in education. And this friend also knew that both Cory Booker and Mark Zuckerberg were going to be going to Herbert Allen's retreat in Sun Valley, Idaho, for the communications industry and billionaire investors and celebrities. And so he suggested that they meet. And they went on a walk, and Zuckerberg told Cory Booker that he was looking for a city that was poised to revolutionize education, where his money could make a big difference. And Cory Booker, as one of Booker's aides said to me, he did his Booker thing, and he persuaded Mark Zuckerberg that this was the place to do it. And Zuckerberg said after meeting him, his quote was, "This is the person I want to invest in. This is the person who can make change." And it was a real Silicon Valley type of thing. You invest in the hero entrepreneur. You don't invest in the business plan. And so there apparently wasn't a lot of due diligence. There were a lot of things Mark Zuckerberg never knew that you would think he should have known and would have known.
About education or about Newark or about Cory?
About all three.
Okay.
And that would end up being real stumbling blocks. But as, and Sheryl Sandberg vetted the plan for him, but I think that all of these people believed that with Cory Booker on their side, they had Superman on their team, and that this was just going to happen.
And Cory, who many people know, very persuasive, now a senator, but what was his depth of understanding of education and how to transform schools?
Well, what he knew about was charter schools, and he had just tremendous faith, just unqualified faith in the power of charter schools to transform education, even in the poorest cities. And I think what he really wanted to do was to have almost an all-charter district. But as it evolved, it turned into, a district that would significantly grow the charter presence. But then he became, convinced that they could take a lot of ideas that had come out of Eli Broad's Institute and other aspects of the reform movement, bring them all to Newark, and turn the Newark district schools, the public schools, into a universe of high-performing schools also. But there was no real understanding of how to do that.
Tell me about Cami Anderson and how she entered the picture.
Well, it took them a whole year to find a superintendent, and they initially had one person in mind. It was John King, who is now the Secretary of Education.
Designated, yeah.
Yeah, yeah.
Senate willing.
Yes, right, or acting. Yeah.
Yes, right.
He, interestingly enough, after talking to, he talked to Zuckerberg. They flew him out to meet Zuckerberg and his wife Priscilla Chan and Sheryl Sandberg. Christie had him come to the governor's retreat on the Jersey Shore for the weekend. Booker took him all around Newark, invited his wife to come in and everything.
And he is the New York super at that point?
He was at that point the number 2 person in New York State in education. He later became the commissioner.
State, but not the city.
Right,
yes,
the
which is-
state.
yeah.
He concluded, after talking to all these people, that they were vastly underestimating how long it would take and what it would take politically and policy-wise and operationally to improve this district. And he said that his desire was to find the place he could make the most difference, and he decided to stay in New York State.
Do the thought experiment, which is how would he done it differently than the way Cami ended up doing it?
I've thought a lot about that. You know, he is he's a totally different personality. I think he probably I think he would have been much more eager to expand charters more quickly. Cami took a slow approach to that. But I think that he felt that the way to do this was for the mayor, Cory Booker, and the superintendent to have breakfast every day with parents in a different district school and just talk to them about what it would take to raise expectations of kids and of teachers, and to change the school district operationally, because the system, it was truly antiquated and dysfunctional, and it really needed to change. And there was a lot of consensus in Newark that that was a problem. And he felt that it could take at least 5 years just to get the systems operating correctly. And it could take that long to persuade parents that they needed to change their expectations of the schools and they needed to look for different approaches. And he felt that it needed to take time. So I think that would have been a very different approach.
And that's not exactly a venture capital of Silicon Valley approach.
No, it's definitely not.
And your implication, because we haven't fully gotten into Cami yet, was he would also have listened a lot and had breakfast every morning with parents. And that's not just the patience of 5 years, but it's we need to do this together and listen. I think by implication you're saying, or having read the book, I know you say, that that was a weakness of Cami.
Well, interestingly, Cami had a lot of meetings with the community, but she used those meetings to tell them what she thought needed to change. And there wasn't as much flow in the other direction. And I think that it's naive to think that you should just ask the community how to improve schools and do what they say. I mean, that's also like a recipe for failure. But there were, I mean, rather than just going to breakfasts and asking people what to do, there were people throughout the Newark district, really terrific teachers, sort of, maybe hidden in a lot of very troubled schools, who very much would have loved to have been part of changing the system. They were they were willing change agents, and they just weren't even tapped. People didn't even know who they were, didn't ask for their input, and as probably most people know, the whole episode turned into doing reform to Newark instead of with Newark, and there was a huge political uprising that ended up stopping a lot of the change in its tracks.
And what caused that uprising?
I think that, oddly enough, I think the reformers caused the uprising. I mean, there was a lot of union opposition, but these unions are not high-performing organizations. I don't think that they could have stopped it by themselves. But the whole approach was, we know what works. You people have screwed this up, and we're going to come in and change this system and change you and save your children.
Well, now let's name who the reformers. We're talking about Cami, but Chris Surf, I think, is in your book. I mean, I know is in your book.
Yeah.
Are you talking about 3 or 4 people? Are you talking about Cory? Or you're just saying there was a whole cadre of people who were a little bit too arrogant?
Well, I think that, he would hate me for saying this, but I think a lot of it was located in Chris Surf, who was the state commissioner of education, Christie's commissioner. And Christie himself would say, I don't care what the people of Newark think, we run the schools, they don't. and just totally back of the hand. And Christy came to Newark very well. It was when Cami Anderson was selected, almost a whole year into the effort. There was a big press conference to introduce her, and she did fabulously at the press conference. Cerf himself did fabulously, and then Christy got up and started taking questions, and mentioned that he had been born in Newark, but his family had left when he was 5, so that he could go to suburban schools. And he said, and quite frankly, if I hadn't gotten out of the Newark schools, I wouldn't be governor today. And he said that in Newark, in front of an audience of people, all of whom had gone to the Newark schools, taught in the Newark schools, were board members of the Newark schools. And it was also at Science High School, which is the highest performing magnet school in Newark. Kids go from Science to Yale. I mean, just a handful, but they go to some of the best schools in the country. And within seconds, all throughout that school, kids had heard that the governor had said that. And because there was an English teacher I knew I bumped into her after the press conference, and she said, "Oh, would you come talk to my students? Just, tell them about writing." And so it was just very impromptu. And the first thing they asked me was, why did the governor say that if he'd gone to school here, he never would have been governor? Mm-hmm. And I just, anyway.
But
so
there were deeper problems in the arrogance and bullying of Chris Christie.
No, that's true. But that was the attitude. That was the attitude that led to a lot of fury in the streets. The other problems were when there was finally this grand plan that was put in place, and Cami Anderson called it One Newark, which was kind of Orwellian because it ended up dividing Newark into 1 million camps, all of them united in one thing, that they wanted her to go. But it was a plan that, if you looked at all of the ideas in it, they made really good sense. The district, it was closing a lot of schools and repurposing them because there had been a tremendous outflow of kids to charters. Almost half of the African American children in Newark are today in charters because they've left the schools. The parents have lost faith in the district schools. So her idea was to take some of the district schools that were just so depopulated. I mean, some of them built for 800 to 1,000 kids with 200 kids in them, and put charter schools in 2 or 3 of those
Co-locate.
schools. Well, no, this was just get rid of that school and make it a charter. And in 3 cases, let them take over the school, let them take the kids. But the problem with that was that the charters wouldn't take all the grades because it was a kindergarten through 8th grade. Charters were used to taking only 1 grade at a time. Right. They went, the extra mile from their perspective and took K through 4. But then the older kids had nowhere to go and had to find another school to go to, which in some cases led to the younger kids leaving too, because parents in Newark, kids walk to school, they count on the older children to get the younger children to school. And so at one of the schools that was taken over by KIPP, the KIPP leaders said that 30% of the kindergarten through 4th grade kids left because the parents felt they couldn't be safe without their siblings walking them to school.
Understandable. It's the 3rd or 4th time you've mentioned charters, and I didn't quite know it had gotten up to half of the population.
No, almost half the African American students are in charters.
40%
40% of the school district is 40%, in charters.
Yeah.
But let me just quickly, so why the reason for the opposition wasn't just the bullying of Christie, but as part of this plan, schools were closed, consolidated, thousands of kids had to change schools because their schools were no longer there. There was a new enrollment system, which instead of people just going to their neighborhood school, kids could choose any school in the city, or parents could. And it was one enrollment application. You could choose a charter or a district school, making it much easier to apply to a charter instead of going through a lottery. And there were preferences for the neediest kids. So if you had special needs, special education needs, if you were high poverty, you got an extra preference to go to your
your
first
top choice.
choice. So it made, in fact, anecdotally, my sense is that there are a lot more high needs kids in this
Charter.
past year who got into charters that in the past have been getting.
So why is that
all
a bad system?
And because it was done without any information and involvement with the parents. So if you're used to your child going to the neighborhood school and just walking down the block to go to school, and suddenly that's no longer what's going on, you have to apply online. There's no transportation offered in a city where 40% of people don't own cars. So, it's not like you can just pick any school and go to it if you don't have transportation. So what happened, and there were school closings, which is a hot button issue
that's
anywhere.
the third rail.
And the mayoral campaign was going on at this moment, and Raz Baraka, who was the candidate running against the reforms, the day after this plan came out, had a big press conference with Weequahic High School, iconic, historic Weequahic High School in Newark, behind him. She had slated that to close, and she afterwards migrated away from that, and Weequahic was just going to house some other schools but still exist as a high school. But I think the problem was that this was sprung on the people of Newark. They had no idea that their entire experience of education was going to change overnight. And this was after 2 or 3 years of these, announcements suddenly coming out of nowhere that this school was going to close or that school was going to close. Cory Booker had been on national television. By the way, this was announced on Oprah, and the people of Newark learned about it at the same time that Oprah's television
The Mark
audience learned.
Zuckerberg gift.
Yeah,
not
the
closing of
$100 million
schools.
gift. Yeah, and so there was immediately this suspicion of why weren't we? If this was going on, why weren't we at the table? Why didn't we have anything to say about it?
Let's leave aside, if we may, just for a moment, the communication and execution problems, which obviously were the whole.
But
leave aside a lot.
Unfortunately, they became
That became the thing that. But we're in Washington, which have an increasing number of charters, is going perhaps to a one application process where I'm not sure, maybe Ross can correct me, but where parents can have choice and there's not much of a distinction. I, as you know, come from New Orleans where there's a one app process and parents get to pick their schools and get one of their top 3 choices. Is that a bad idea theoretically, leaving aside how they executed it in Newark?
It doesn't seem like a bad idea at all, but it seems like you have to have transportation to get, because otherwise what does choice mean if you can't get there? And they later put in a small-scale transportation, but it wasn't, like you had to take a bus to this school and then go to another school. It wasn't like you could just go to school. So, but I mean, it seems to me as you have, it's a new world. There are cities like Newark and Washington, D.C. that are almost half kids in charters, and there should be a seamless process for people to choose.
And do you think that the rise and increase in charter schools in places like that, where it gets up to half, leave aside New Orleans, which is totally is 100% anomalous, is that a good thing for school reform, or is that draining kids from, quote, the public system?
Well, it depends on the city. I know that in Newark, the charter schools they have a couple of networks of really excellent charter schools, KIP and Uncommon. And those are, I think, together more than half of the charter seats in Newark. And the kids do phenomenally well. They do way better than they do in the district schools. There is some selection bias left over from the days of the lotteries, and there's still not as many kids in special ed or in the most severe categories of special ed, but I think it's clear these schools are really good
and
for
those
kids.
things are fixable, I assume, meaning you can say you get this much more if you take a special ed kid, and you can't skim and not take them. Eventually you can iron that out.
Yeah, well,
so
the preferences are changing that. So, I mean, I think it's a good thing. I guess that what I feel is not a good thing and needs to be part of the package is what happens to the district schools and the kids in them. Because, in Newark, there's a report that the KIP schools did recently where they looked at the data and they said that because of the growth of charters in Newark, there's now, in the last 5 years, African American kids are twice as likely to be in a high performance school, meaning it outperforms the state average. And those are all charter schools.
Mhm.
The problem is that you have 60% of the kids in Newark in district schools, and the district schools are in crisis.
Do they get worse because charters are there, or do they get better?
Well, so far they haven't gotten better. You have like in the years since the Zuckerberg gift was given, the test scores show that overall the district schools have gone down in the 5 years, not up. And for example, there's two grades that are down 9 points in reading. Another two are down 6 points in reading. Those are not just statistical,
Yeah, anomalies.
blips. Yeah, and I don't know. I mean, I do know because I was in schools, and what happened was that, um, lots of kids were consolidated into,
Mhm.
like, two schools would be consolidated into one, and it tended to be that they closed the schools that were the lowest performing. Those were also the schools with the highest poverty. So you're concentrating the kids with the greatest needs in individual schools, and because the district is now in a huge financial crisis because money leaves to go, money follows the kids. So as kids leave for charters, the district school budget goes down. They have trouble just, on a dime downsizing because of, tenure seniority, civil service protections. And so there's an over 80 billion, well, I think $60 billion budget gap in the district now. And there have been huge cuts in support services and counseling and the kinds of services that are so necessary in these high need schools. So I saw schools that had been in the early years of Cami Anderson's leadership, she had given them more resources and brought in a new principal in several cases, allowed them to pick a number of their own teachers so that they could assemble a team that was aligned behind their vision. Schools started to have, like, they didn't have improved test scores, but they had a much better environment and culture, and you could believe
Mhm.
this was going to lead to improved performance. And then suddenly they get 200 or 300 more kids, and they don't have the support they need for these, to
Mm.
help these kids. And there were teachers who were like some these schools, some of them had some of the best teachers I'd ever seen. These were district schools, particularly a teacher who was maybe the best special needs teacher in the whole city of Newark. She taught behavior disordered kids who were like some of the most troubled, challenging
Mhm.
kids. She ended up retiring early last year because she felt that the way the system was running, it was impossible to serve those kids, and
Mhm.
she couldn't keep doing it. And so there were that. I think that kind of stress and chaos is one reason that the achievement is down. But I can't
Sure.
begin to say what the other reasons
But
are.
the extracting from both your book and what you just said, giving school leaders a lot more autonomy to set a vision for their school, whether it's a district run school or a charter management organization run school. That's the important thing.
Yeah, and I actually there's a school in the book that is a charter school that it well part of the big problem in Newark is that the district schools get so much less money to the school building for teachers, social workers, tutors, interventionists, all of those kinds of services than the charter schools do. The charter schools start out with less money and get, in the case of the two schools I looked at that were geographically close, the charter and the district school, the charter got 50% more dollars to the building. And so, like, they had $12,000 per kid getting to the charter school and less than $8,000 per kid getting to the district
Yeah.
school, even though the district starts out with more money. And the charter school had two teachers in every classroom from kindergarten through third grade, and in the district school it was one. The charters had a tutor for every grade, so if those two teachers weren't enough to meet the needs of the kids, the tutor pushed in, and there
Wait,
were
and so how
three.
did that happen? I
Um,
mean, why did the charters get more money? Is that
no,
because,
they get less money.
right, okay,
Why did they get more money to the building?
yeah.
Well, I can only imagine. I mean, I actually tried to solve this, to resolve this question for myself, and I did find, there are contracts with the most incredibly connected political cronies for things like the scaffolding around crumbling buildings. I mean,
At the public
in the district
district
schools.
run schools.
And oh, the district school, I asked them to give me the cost per pupil for services that they provide outside the classroom. So Custodial services, the district spends $1,200 per pupil. The KIPP charters they opened their books and let me see them. They spend $400 per pupil. Now that's not the difference between a union wage and a non-union wage. That's just bloat. The district, and this is true of school districts, in
Yep.
inner cities everywhere. They, for generations, have been the employers of last resort as well as the
But
providers.
is that an argument, or isn't that an argument? I'll not try to tilt it, for more charters rather than fewer?
Well, you could say that. You could also say it's a huge argument for digging into school districts and try to make them operate better. And come, I actually ended up feeling like if I could have done this myself, knowing what I know now, I would have hired a forensic auditing firm if there is such a thing.
Yes, there is.
There is, okay, there should be.
Yeah.
Come in and just absolutely x-ray that district budget and see why money isn't getting to the classroom. And then have a very public, transparent process. There was no transparent process. They had 10 community engagement sessions run by a political consultant from New York who didn't know his way around Newark. And people came in at the outset and said how they wanted this $100 million to be spent. And then, it was thrown away. And so I think what I would have done is taken the results of this forensic audit and say to the people of Newark, here's the money that's not getting to your kids. Here is, take that charter school. Here's what we could be doing for kids. What are the tough choices we're willing to make as a community to accomplish that?
And do you think the tough choices would have been made?
I think
or
a lot.
is there
I think
something systemic about?
I think it would have been really hard. I don't want to be foolish and naive and say, oh, that would have been easy. But I just think it would be really hard to look at what, that you could have 2 children in every classroom. You could have a tutor for every grade.
Right.
You could have, oh, by the way, the
Win
charter
political
school.
support is what you're saying.
Yeah, I mean, I think you could build a base around that. And I would think, in Boston, it's the same thing. They have tremendous amount of.
Last 2 questions, one about theory and then and then I'm going to open it up. Is the best way to get from here to there to have at least a substantial number of charters so that you can do that forensic comparison, or would it be better to just say, let's keep the urban school systems but break the china of all the things that are wrong?
Well, I mean, there are charters. I mean, people are creating charters and they're serving kids in some cases really well, in other cases not. I think where they are serving kids well, they should be there. I don't think you should just say don't start them until we can break the china, because then we'll be waiting another 25 years.
I mean, it may be a way of breaking the china by starting
actually,
them.
I think that because the charter. I mean, I actually think the charters might make it easier at this point to ask these questions in Newark, because they are having to lay off dozens. I mean, hundreds of people are being laid off in these jobs that. I mean, Cami Anderson herself said, with great regret, we're increasing poverty in Newark in order to accomplish school reform, because we're laying off custodians and security guards and cafeteria workers. And these are people who will never find a job that's that secure and that has wages that can sustain a family in this economy.
Yeah, that, I'm sorry, I said it was Greenland, but that has been an argument from New Orleans to Washington, whatever, is if you try to make these schools more efficient, you're actually hurting the community, because that's the employer in that community, which is the extra custodial workers, the extra.
Yeah.
And I guess that's above our pay grade. That's a higher macroeconomic argument, which is if you're making jobs and work, but it's inefficient for the school, but it's good for the community.
Right, but it's
the role
not.
of the school.
But it's not irrelevant, because, I mean, poverty is a root cause of failure in the Newark schools. There's no question about it. And if you're increasing poverty, you're.
My last question, then I'll open up, because everybody here actually knows so much about education. What happened to the $100 million? Where's the money?
Well,
I know, because I've read the book,
yes,
but go ahead.
It's mostly gone. There's about $30 million that hasn't been spent, but has been allocated. So it's actually not free floating money at this point. Well, it was actually $200 million, because Cory Booker said he would match the $100 million. So of the $200 million, $60 million went to expand the charter schools. $89 million was set aside for a new teacher and a new principal's contract, and that's very questionable. That so much money was put on the table. A huge part of it was just the district teachers wouldn't come to the table unless they got $31 million in back pay from the 3 years they'd worked without a contract and without raises. So Zuckerberg wrote a $31 million check to get the teacher's contract. So they had like a $31 million in back pay, and the merit pay, which they thought was the great lever that was going to, make teachers teach better, which was an unresolved question. But anyway, that the merit pay was $6 million for over 3 years, and the back pay was $31 million.
Yeah. So.
So
But it's mainly a tale of bad execution as opposed to bad theory and intentions. I mean, they just messed it up.
they did. But I do think that oh, and I guess I left out $20 million went to consultants whose job it was to.
That's what I was going to get
Yeah,
at, because that was the holy outrage in one chapter. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, it's some of them did valuable work, and I didn't mean to say that consultants by definition are, counterproductive, but
You
it
can
was.
say, in this room, you can
But
say
there
that.
was a lot. There was a lot of just studies that went nowhere, and that had very little to do with kids' needs. But I do think when you say, was the theory wrong? I think that the idea of having all those consultants was they wanted to do systems reform at the top of the district, so they were going to have, new, like I said, new teachers contract, new principals contract, new evaluation system, new data system, all these new systems. But there wasn't there wasn't the concentration on the classroom, and how do you get money to the classroom, and how do you develop supports, really badly needed supports for these kids who live in extreme poverty and literally need that in order to learn. That wasn't at all. And in fact, there was an email that went out early in the negotiations between Booker and Zuckerberg that said MZ's money is not going to the classroom. It was all about systems and systems at the top. And the absence of focus on the classroom, I think, was a theoretical mistake.
That was yeah. And we can get. I do want to turn it over, but maybe it'll be asked, or I'll come back at it. The concept that at least we learned in New Orleans, that you can't just do the classroom. It's good to have a health clinic and a after-school activities and a whole, children's zone, as Jeffrey Canada put it, as a wraparound is quite important. But let me open it. Yes.
So you alluded a little bit to the union's role in all of this. So I'm curious as to your opinion about their role, and also what role they could have played in helping do this systems change, because everyone knows anytime you approach system change, it's difficult work.
Right. Well, the union was not. Well, I should say I was going to say the union was not productive in helping to change the district, but I shouldn't say that because they did agree to this teacher's contract, which to a layperson doesn't sound like a big deal, but in Newark, you used to get a raise every year as a teacher, almost regardless of performance. And under the new contract, unless you're rated effective or highly effective, you do not get a raise anymore in Newark. And the goal of that is over time to discourage the teachers who are not getting good ratings from staying in the district and having a career as a teacher. And that was a huge, compromise for the union to make. And in fact, I think it ended up leading to a lot of opposition within the union against the union leader, the president, who embraced that. So, it was a controversial kind of daring thing to embrace. But on the other hand, the unions basically saw any expansion of charter schools as a threat to jobs, which it is in reality. And they mobilized just, marches, and they came to every school board meeting with posters that had, pictures of Cami Anderson with blood running down her face, and said "liar," and
Here's
Christine.
Cami, for those of you who haven't yet bought the book.
The superintendent. Yeah. And so there was a picnic that they had at one point, pretty early on, in which they hosted the entire school board was on their side, because Newark School Board is an advisory board. It has no power because the state runs the district. So it becomes just like this sort of playground for demagogues to just get, take office and, act like we're victims, you're victims, we're all victims of outsiders. And so they were, and they teamed up with the union, but the union, at one of the school board presidents said at this union picnic, look, whatever we do, it really annoys them. So we just had to keep doing it. We just had to keep harassing
shouldn't
them,
laugh. I'm sorry.
showing up at their speeches and picketing and, blocking intersections. And, so it was just kind of like this scattershot campaign to annoy them, to annoy the reformers. And that's why I felt that if it hadn't been that the plans and the sort of secretive nature of the whole effort hadn't inflamed parents and just community leaders and people throughout the city, I don't think that they would have been able to stop anything just with the union.
Let me, by the way, introduce Nancy Peltz-Padgett and Ross Weiner, who both run the education programs of the Aspen Institute. So if you need to know more or you want to be involved, you should definitely talk to them. Do you have a question? Ross.
Sure. I'm looking at, so Chris Surf, you mentioned, Ren State is now Cami's successor as the superintendent of Newark, with seems to be somewhat vague announcement that they're going to begin the process of returning Newark to actually a locally accountable school board as opposed to state run. So I'm just curious for your take on, one, how do you see the Chris Surf superintendency shaping up? How's it different or continuing what Cami had led? And do you, what's your take on, are they going to, is there a real plan to transfer Newark back to local control, and how do you see that? And frankly, are you optimistic about what comes out of that, or pessimistic?
Okay. Well, I'll start with the middle question. There is a real process to return local control to Newark, and this is happening for complicated reasons. But when it started when Christie really hit the campaign trail running for president. So he's basically saying, been there, done that. We're gonna like give Newark back to the city and the people. And but I think the fact that he puts Chris Surf in as the superintendent means that he's not going to just return the district and let Newark do as it wants. He's going to try to embed the changes that they've made so far. So I think that, the teacher's contract has already expired, the one I was telling you about, but it stays in effect until there's a new contract. And I think, to the extent that, well, first of all, so Surf is really aggressively using the contract to try to, exit the teachers who aren't high-performing teachers. He's basically doing everything the same way Cami Anderson did, except he is meeting very often and publicly with everybody who wants to meet with him. Cami Anderson had stopped going to school board meetings 14 months before she left because they had become so vitriolic, and she said it was counterproductive. But he goes, and he kind of, he accepts the idea that, you can't be, a state operator of a school district and not be available publicly for people. And so it's not like anybody thinks, oh, this is, we've come to the promised land. But there is an acknowledgement that this is better. This is really a better approach. I also think, that Surf is going to, I think in addition to the contract, I think he'll do everything he can to embed the reforms they have accomplished. The new school, not new schools so much, but the schools that were consolidated and got new principals. I think he's going to try to make sure that those schools have what they need to get better, instead of like what happened last year when all these kids flooded into them. I think he is. I think his approach is to try to grapple with the budget crisis, which Cami had not. She left that behind. There were crazy blow-ups with things like the enrollment system, which was supposed to be such an improvement to make it simpler. Last year, when it started, there were like hours-long, even days-long delays of parents getting their kids signed up who hadn't succeeded in going online. That's okay. And so, he completely smoothed out that system this year, and that wasn't a problem. So I think he's looking for the most egregious problems that were created by this disruptive change and trying to make them more palatable to people. So that, but finally, I think the reason that this is happening, and Surf said this to me, is that there's probably going to be a Democrat in the governor's office after Christie leaves in a couple of years. And there's no way a Democrat is going to keep control of the Newark schools after this huge uprising of this big democratic city demanding control back. And so it was going to happen anyway. And I think their feeling was, let's do it over a period of time, maybe 1 to 3 years, when we can actually make sure that the schools have changed. Asking me whether I'm optimistic, I wish I were. I don't really, I think that the district has to make these really tough choices. It's not just this budget gap this year, it's going to continue because people are continuing to send their kids to charters. The teen schools are announcing, the KIPP schools are announcing today that they're going to increase their footprint. They're going to open new schools, so that'll mean more people going to charters, and that'll mean more of a budget crisis. And I don't know how the local politicians in Newark are going to confront this issue and not and stand up to the unions who are going to say this is destroying public education. So I don't know how they're going to make good decisions around that. It's going to be really tough.
Way back there? Yeah, hey. One of our former.
Thank you.
Not surprising. Ask you a little more about the role of philanthropy in all this. If he seemed to, Zuckerberg, and it seemed to disappear a little bit from your story today. Was that the case, or what do you end up feeling about the role of philanthropy in all of this?
Well, I think that the Newark chapter of education reform was not a fine hour for philanthropy. I think that, Zuckerberg he literally at age 26 made this big gift. And I think he thought if he gave this money to Cory Booker, it would be spent well and they would end up transforming education. The goal was actually, and this was Booker and Zuckerberg's goal, was to turn Newark around and then figure out what it took to turn Newark around, package that as a model for turning around all urban districts, and take it to cities across the country. And Zuckerberg was hoping that this would be his philanthropy, that he would go to cities all across the country transforming public education. So I think it was just a real lack of understanding of what it takes to do that. Like the people who gave the matching money, a lot of them were Cory Booker's political supporters who wanted to help him succeed with this. And they didn't put any, like William Ackman gave $25 million to match, a quarter of the $100 million. And he put absolutely no caveats or restrictions on it. And I asked him why. And he said, because the goal was to help kids and I thought it would get to the right place. But basically, he's a huge political supporter of Cory Booker. So he wanted him to succeed. And Governor Christie got almost $20 million from his political supporters to match the money. And they didn't even, I interviewed Ken Langone, and he thinks that his money went to something that never happened. It wasn't like they gave this money and then were vigilantly trying to make sure that it went there. There was so much, it was at least as much politics as philanthropy. And I think that, giving philanthropy to politicians and expecting them to lead a policy change is just, I don't know that you needed this to happen for you to know that that's not a good idea, but I think we now know that's not a great idea.
Yeah, way back there, and then I'll get you too. Go ahead. And yeah.
So I feel like in the book, and for a very good reason, all the politicians and leaders came off pretty badly, though they came off as having good intentions. And then there were teachers and principals who came off really well, and so it was sort of good guys, bad guys. But I'm curious to know if you can do a little bit of like bad guy ranking, or to state it in an opposite way, who was the best of the bad actors in your mind, in terms whether good intentions and just poor execution, or really trying hard to execute well, but was in an environment where it just wasn't going to work.
I actually think that Mark Zuckerberg is a good guy. I think he's really sincere, and I think he's really, concerned about what happened with this gift. And I think that's evident in the way he's pursuing his philanthropy now in California. I think, I mean, his wife, I don't know if you all are familiar with her, Priscilla Chan, is somebody who grew up poor, went to public school, feels that, she ended up at Harvard. She felt that it was, her public school teachers who put her on that path. And then she spent her entire time outside of class at Harvard volunteering in 2 housing projects in Dorchester where there were extremely high poverty kids and mentoring. It was an after school program in which it wasn't just academic tutoring, but it was actually mentoring them to deal with the challenges of growing up poor. And she became extremely convinced that a teacher alone can't overcome the needs of a kid who's growing up in poverty. And she then went to medical school, spent her entire residency and internship working in safety net hospitals around San Francisco, and most of her patients were foster children and children whose families couldn't afford health insurance. And she's now trying to use their philanthropy to start a school that would be a school and a health center, a community health center co-located with neuroscience experts and all of the counseling so that they can identify children with trauma, which is incredibly common, in Newark and in cities like it, and have services that are filtered into the whole education system. And she said that she wanted the measure of a child's well-being to be academic, social, and their physical health, all 3. So anyway, I think that's really impressive.
Yeah, I think there was a gentleman there, Alma, and the gentleman here, and that'll be it, because so make the questions and answers a little shorter.
Not a speech, a quick question. When Al Shanker generated the genesis of the charter movement some 30 years ago, was that the charter schools would essentially kind of be beacons of experimentation and so forth. And I applaud your book because it provides a counter narrative to the top-down, but many people feel an arrogant top-down strategies. And I guess my question is, with the KIPP schools, and I'm agnostic about charters, I think they're a wonderful idea, but did you find any evidence of the KIPP schools basically influencing the deteriorating nature of the general public school system?
And you might mention your son if you want.
Oh,
yeah.
Yeah. Well, I wouldn't say that the KIPP schools or that even, well, I was going to say, I wouldn't say that the KIPP schools are responsible for the decline of the Newark schools. I should also disclose that I have a son who taught for 2 years at a KIPP school in New York City. But he actually taught there after I reported on the KIPP school in Newark, so I didn't go there because of him or anything. But I think it's really it's too simple to say that the KIPP schools are causing the decline of the Newark schools. No, I'm just saying.
Yeah.
I'm just saying. I think that's too simple because the parents are leaving the Newark schools because they're failing their kids and they're not. And a big thing is that they don't feel that their kids are safe in the Newark schools, whereas they do feel that they're safe in some of the charter schools. But I think that there is a definite problem of not so much of the better, the more motivated parents and kids leaving the district, but of the money leaving the district and nobody knowing how to stabilize these schools where, in DC, half the kids go, in Newark, 60% of the kids go, and there's just a constant state of chaos, really, in trying to stabilize these schools.
Although, let us say that Kaya is doing it better.
She's doing
than
it,
most.
much better.
We have so many questions, Alma, and then there and there, yeah. Last 2.
I haven't had the pleasure. I've heard about your book. I haven't had the pleasure of reading it. I'll buy it. But I know this review in the New York Times. Excuse me. I know of your the review that you received from Alex Kotlowitz in the New York Times, which is amazing. I would say, and I was wondering if you would agree that great philanthropy requires stewardship, and perhaps the winner from all of this is Zuckerberg, who took his money and went to San Francisco and is making that school system a much better one because
you
of his
mentioned that
experience
before.
in Newark.
Yes. No, I actually think that. I mean, he said that, he was like, I know he's not known for his humility, but he said when he started out that he didn't know anything about philanthropy, and he was hoping from this experience to become a better philanthropist. And he was in a learning mode, and I think he really did learn.
Actually, he has we
Expensive lesson, yeah.
expensive, but he is a person actually with some sense of humility, and that he learns well and
Yeah,
fast
yeah.
about many,
I
many
think he's a
things.
very serious learner.
Yeah, he's a serious. I didn't want to leave him. I've known people who don't listen, and Mark is a good listener. Yeah.
Your book, which is terrific, references Washington, D.C. and the transition from Michelle Reed to Kai Henderson. And I'm wondering whether you think that there may soon be a second generation of leaders like Kai Henderson who are better able to mediate between communities and more ideological school reform.
That's a great question.
I do think that, because I think there's a real recognition that, you know, the confrontational, get out of the way, we know what works, you don't, it's counterproductive. And also, I mean, it's counterproductive politically, but it's counterproductive strategically, because like, as I was saying, there are so many terrific teachers in these failing schools and troubled schools who can tell you how to fix the schools or how to provide the support that kids need that they're not getting. And if you're not talking to them, you're really missing a lot of opportunity for change.
Right there.
So I'm going to pick up really quickly on 2 points you made. The sort of chaos that you see in some of these schools, and much earlier you talked about the sort of insane burden on teachers' shoulders when they're trying to teach in a school that's so heavily poor and so troubling. And we've seen this over and over. Tony Bright actually wrote about some of these schools in Chicago where it was just impossible to transform them. And in fact, the reality is that in this entire country, we've never been able to transform that kind of district, a district where all the kids are living in poverty and have these kind of struggles. And an example is New Orleans, which is still one of the worst performing school districts in the state of Louisiana.
That's actually not true, but I mean, it is now much.
No.
Okay, we'll talk later. But you have your facts totally wrong. New Orleans has come above the average of Louisiana last year.
We can definitely talk about the facts, but even when you do all of that, the school districts that really have a few of the kind of more unsung heroes, Cincinnati, Ohio, a little one in Washington, Vancouver, have taken the approach that Priscilla talks about that's been around for a pretty long time, that really do require attending to all the kids' needs and taking a much longer term look at this and saying, if it took us 30, 40 years to dig into this concentrating poverty, it will take us decades to dig out. How do we persuade philanthropists and policymakers to take a much more patient, measured approach and to look at the whole kid and the whole community?
Well, you know, Priscilla Chan might be a good messenger. Because I think she sees it that way, and I don't think she sees that this is something you could do in 5 years, which is what, you know, Cory Booker and Mark Zuckerberg initially promised. So, I mean, you know, she's a hopeful agent, and she's a new voice.
But how do you say to a mother or father, we can't do it in time for your kid?
Well, I don't think you say we're not, you know, you try, you do everything you can, but you have to acknowledge that if you don't see transformational results in 5 years, that doesn't mean you walk away. You keep working and you provide everything you can. But, you know, we have to solve poverty. I mean, what all of these things that we're talking about that schools did that got better results in Newark were about having resources available to address the consequences of poverty. It's just, and that's not going to fix it for every child, but that's going to fix it for more children. But, you know, the state of the cities is the real issue, and that's, you know.
And so what's the big takeaway here? I mean, this is about one district that mismanaged it, but tried different things. Is the big idea that we really have to look at a broader thing than just the classroom, or that school reform can't stand alone, or that we need to have competition?
You know, I think that I still come back to this feeling that, you know, like you said, or, you know, it's going to take a generation. If you know, if we get on the right path, it would take a generation. But I think that there needs to be a lot more investment, or figure out how to get the investment we have to the level of the schools to deal with the consequences of poverty that kids bring into the classroom every day, while we keep trying, hopefully as a nation, to address what's wrong with our cities in a larger sense. Because, you know, I mean, I don't believe that poverty should be invoked as an excuse for failure, but I do think that poverty is, you know, and the things that come with it in Newark, all the pathologies that come with it, the violence, the drugs, the family dysfunction, everything, you know, makes it just like, you know, you're asking the teacher to overcome all of that. And, you know, that's some kids can be reached by some teachers, but that's not something
So
that,
for philanthropy, to get back both to the question and everything, it's a more holistic approach than trying to find these silver
well, yeah,
bullets.
and you know, I mean, this is, I think like ideas keep coming around every 20 years,
Yeah.
the same ideas, but now there's a lot more interest in community schools, which is schools that have services for adults in the neighborhood as well as
Yeah.
the kids, and schools that are open after hours so that there's a place, a safe place for kids to go where adults could help them. And, you know, to me, that seems like, you know, I mean, I know it's been tried before and everybody says, well, that didn't work. But, you know, if you do that with a really, you know, a really strategic attitude of what are these services and how are we going to provide them and who are the people going to be who are serving these adults and these kids, I think that that's, again, like addressing the consequences of poverty. And it sounds like a much more holistic way to do it than just expecting teachers and a school all by itself to create miracles.
Bravo. Let me thank Dale for being here, old friend. We'll continue this conversation, but part of the reason we have this is people get to sign and sell books. So the conversation will continue with our friends at Politics and Prose. Dale will stick around, we'll all stick around, and I think there's food and drink, so stick around. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Walter. Thank you. That was, yeah.
Yeah, I think